You've landed here at Ritualistically Botanica. If you're new here, my name is Mo and I'm your host. I am doing a series. I titled it Dead Authors and Living Ideas. And this is all based on that 1840s, 1917-ish period. I think that's about the Art Deco period. And it was a time when this concept, or a whole movement actually, called New Thought came on the scene. And pretty much it was a deconstruction of the religious traditions and way of thinking of that time. There were 4 earlier voices, and behind all of them was the man who helped get this entire conversation started. His name was Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, and we need to talk about him. He was a clockmaker, an inventor, an Aquarius, because apparently repairing clocks wasn't complicated enough. So this man decided to start taking apart the human mind. Let me tell you something about the way I'm approaching these people. I'm not interested in deciding that somebody was a spiritual genius simply because he wrote a mysterious book, talked about invisible forces. But I am also not interested in declaring that a spiritual practice failed just because nobody manifested a mansion. Sometimes a practice changes your psychology before it changes your circumstances. Sometimes it changes the way you think, the way you speak, the way you respond, and the amount of bullshit you are willing to tolerate. And those changes can be real long before they show up in your bank account. So, with that understanding, let's talk about the man who helped kick open this entire conversation about the power of the mind, Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. And no, he did not arrive wearing a robe, carrying a crystal, or announcing himself as the Grand High Chancellor of the astral plane. He was a clockmaker, which honestly makes a certain amount of sense. If you spend enough time figuring why complicated mechanisms stop working, eventually you might start looking at people and wondering whether some of us are running on the wrong damn settings. Phineas Parkhurst Quimby was born on February 16th of 1802 in Lebanon, New Hampshire, which makes him an Aquarius. Of course it does. Give an Aquarius a perfectly ordinary explanation for reality, and sooner or later he is going to take it apart, rearrange the pieces, and ask whether everybody else has considered doing the whole thing differently. His family moved to Belfast, Maine, when he was a small child. His father was a blacksmith. The family did not have the kind of money that sent children off to prestigious institutions to collect degrees and develop unnecessary opinions about wine. Quimby had limited formal schooling. What he did have was curiosity, mechanical ability, and a mind that apparently did not know how to leave a question alone. So he worked as a watchmaker and clockmaker. He developed inventions. He experimented with mechanical devices. He even worked with early photography. So before anybody else tries to turn him into some dreamy little Victorian cloud floating around in a seance, understand this: the man worked with actual physical objects. From an engineering perspective, things that either functioned or did not. Clocks, machinery, mechanisms, and of course the physical world. And I think that matters because he was not beginning with, let me imagine something dramatic and see who will pay me for it. He was beginning with a more interesting question. What if there are mechanisms operating in the mind that we do not yet understand? Now let's handle the personal questions, because you know I'm going to ask. Was he married? Yes. On December 23rd of 1827, he married Suzanne Burnham Harridan. Did they have children? Yes, 4 of them. John Harridan Quimby, William Henry Quimby, Suzanne Augusta Quimby, generally just known as Augusta, and George Albert Quimby. And his family was not just decorative background scenery. His daughter Augusta assisted him with patience. His son George helped preserve and defend his work. And his wife Susanna was involved in community efforts in Belfast. These were real people living a real life, not a collection of symbolic figures appearing conveniently in somebody's mystical origin story. The family also experienced real loss. Their son William died before his father did. And I mention that because spiritual practitioners do not get immunity from grief just because they have interesting ideas about the mind. Life still happens. The body still happens. loss still happens. And if somebody tries to sell you a philosophy that guarantees otherwise, run. Now, how long did Quimby live? Well, he died on January 16th of 1866 in Belfast, Maine, and he was only 63 years old, exactly 1 month short of his 64th birthday. Now, I am 73, so technically, I have already outlasted him. Do I think that means I have unblocked a higher level of spiritual power? No. Genetics and luck. It means I am still here, and he is not. That's it. Mortality is not a failed manifestation. Nobody has figured out how to avoid dying, including the people selling courses about becoming limitless. But it does mean we need to keep our feet on the floor when somebody starts talking as if the power of thought gives you complete control over the human body. It doesn't. Now, I'm going to answer something because I know you're going to ask, was he wealthy? Well, this is where it gets interesting. The 1860 census listed Quimby with $3,500 in real estate and $1,500 in personal property. That is about $5,000 in reported property altogether. Now remember, the period was Art Deco period. Now that does not tell us his income. It does not tell us his debts. And it does not mean he was sitting in a velvet smoking jacket with a secret vault full of metaphysical money. But it does tell us he was not wandering around penniless, trying to pay for breakfast with positive affirmations. He owned property, he had a profession, he supported a family. Was he some fabulously wealthy spiritual tycoon? There is no reliable evidence of that. But was he financially non-existent? Also no. And listen, if we're going to be fair, we cannot make money the only measurement of whether somebody contributed something meaningful. If a person helped people feel less frightened, less helpless, or less trapped inside their own thinking, that matters. And that's what a lot of this New Thought movement did. You cannot always deposit psychological relief at the bank, but you can damn sure feel the difference when you wake up able to live your life. Now, how did this clockmaker end up becoming interested in mental healing? Part of the story begins with his own health. Quimby later described a period when he believed he was seriously ill with what people at that time called consumption, which was tuberculosis. He noticed that excitement and physical activity, particularly riding a horse, seemed to temporarily change how he felt. Of course, distracted him from his mental depression over his illness. I'm sure, but that's me talking. Did that prove he cured a medically confirmed disease with his thoughts? No. We do not have the kind of medical documentation that would allow us to make any such claim, but it raised a question for him. Why would a change in mental or emotional state affect the way the body felt? And that is not a foolish question. That is a question people are still investigating. Fear affects the body. Stress affects the body. Expectation also affects the body. And relief affects the body. So none of that means every illness is imaginary, but it does mean the mind and body are not behaving like two strangers waiting for separate buses. By the late 1830s and early 1840s, Quimby had become interested in mesmerism. Now, this was the era of animal magnetism, magnetic sleep, trance demonstrations, and people confidently announcing that invisible forces were moving through everybody like Victorian Wi-Fi. And Quimby wanted to know what, if anything, was actually happening. He worked with a young man named Lucius E. Berkman. By 1843, they were traveling and giving public demonstrations. That's the equivalent of following festivals today. Carnivals, maybe. Berkman would enter a trance, and Quimby investigated claims involving thought, perception, diagnosis, and information that supposedly became available in that altered state. One newspaper even called Quimby the Napoleon of magnetizers. Were these demonstrations proof that Berkman could read minds? I don't think so. Of course not. Any more than if you go today to one of those shows where psychic starts calling out Mary, Mary, the name Mary. Does that ring with anybody? That's kind of cold reading, but that's me. Could expectation, suggestion, observation, performance, or other ordinary explanations have played a role? Absolutely. And we should say that. But Quimby was not simply satisfied with the spectacle. He started questioning the explanation behind it. Was there really some mysterious force, some magnetic fluid moving from one person to another? Or was the mind doing something more complicated? This is the shift. That is why he matters. He began moving away from the performance and toward the underlying question. What happens when one person's thoughts, expectations, and beliefs affect another person's experience? By the 1850s, he was seeing patients. He practiced in Bangor and later established himself in Portland, Maine. And people came to him because they were suffering. Some were frightened, and many of them were just exhausted. Some had been told discouraging things about their health. Some had tried treatments that did not help. And Quimby began developing the ideas that belief, fear, and mistaken assumptions could contribute to a person's suffering. Now, let me stop right there before somebody runs off and does something stupid. That does not mean illness is always caused by negative thinking. It does not mean sick people created their own disease. And it does not mean that a person with cancer needs better affirmations instead of an oncologist. Absolutely not. If your body needs medical care, by God, go get medical care. But if fear makes symptoms worse, if hopelessness prevents a person from functioning, or if a terrifying diagnosis becomes its own psychological injury, then addressing the person's mental state may matter. It may matter enormously. And this is where I think Quimby deserves more generosity than a quick little skeptical eye roll. He may have been offering people attention, reassurance, interpretation, hope, and a sense that their condition was not the whole of their identity. And that is therapeutic. And therapeutic is not a small thing. Was his method completely free of physical practices? No. There were some kind of new alternative treatment methods. Hydrotherapy, which is submersion into baths and steam baths and saunas, and diets and different types of massages, all were used. So there are accounts that describe him using water, touching patients, and working directly with the body. So let's not rewrite him into a perfectly modern psychologist who never did anything strange. He was a 19th century practitioner working with 19th century assumptions. He used language and methods that can sound unusual to us. Some of his claims went beyond what can be established. But that does not mean every person who left his office feeling better was pretending. It means experience and explanation are not the same thing. A person can genuinely improve without the practitioner having correctly identified the mechanism. And frankly, that distinction would save a lot of modern spiritual communities from embarrassing themselves. Now, who did Quimby hang around with? Well, first there was Lucius Berkmar, his early trance subject. His son George became an important defender of his work. His daughter Augusta helped with patients. Emma Ware and Sarah Ware were also part of the circle surrounding him. And then there were Julius and Annetta Dresser, who became important advocates for his ideas. But the name that really makes this story interesting is Mary Baker Eddy. I'm going to highlight her in another video. When she first came to Quimby in 1862, she was known as Mary Patterson. She sought treatment from him in Portland and saw him periodically over the following years. Now later, she published Science and Health and became the founder of Christian Science, which was a whole worldwide movement. She did a whole lot more, but we'll talk about her in her own video. And that is where the Victorian metaphysical custody battle begins, because some people argued that Quimby's ideas influenced Eddy. Other people argued that she developed a fundamentally different religious and healing system. So basically, you'll find that I think had she given him any credit or mention, this would not have become such a great public argument, but she didn't. Quimby supporters wanted credit given to Quimby. Eddy insisted her teachings were distinct. And after Quimby died, various people spent a great deal of energy arguing over who had originated what. Now remember that history belongs to the victor and also to whoever survives, right? And Quimby died before Eddy. Was Eddy influenced by her experience with him? It would be strange to assume she learned absolutely nothing from someone she consulted repeatedly. Does that prove she copied his entire system? No, she copied enough that she should have given him some mention and credit. Does it prove plagiarism? No, not exactly. The historical relationship is contested, though. And when the people telling the story are also trying to defend their own movement, their own teacher, or their own spiritual inheritance, you have to read carefully between those lines. Everybody has a perspective. Everybody has a favorite version. And some people have a very strong financial and religious incentive to make sure their version wins. Now, here's the part I find especially revealing. Quimby did not publish the major book associated with his name during his own lifetime. Read that again in your mind. The man who helped launch an entire conversation about mental healing died in 1866. The Quimby Manuscripts appeared in 1921, 55 years later. Very similar to the writings of Jesus, right? I'm just joking. I'm just saying that time difference. So when you pick up that book, you're not reading a volume Quimby personally prepared, approved, and released to the public. You're reading a later collection of his writings edited by Horatio W. Dresser. Does that name sound familiar? It should. Horatio was the son of Julius and Anita Dresser. Remember them? I mentioned them earlier. And before anybody gets too comfortable calling him Quimby's personal student, remember that Horatio was born in 1866. That was the same year that Quimby died. And so unless the man was receiving advanced metaphysical instruction directly from the crib, he was not sitting in Quimby's office taking notes. He inherited a family perspective, and that perspective influenced the way Quimby's work was presented. Later researchers have questioned aspects of how those writings were edited and interpreted. That doesn't mean the whole collection is worthless. It means we need to know the difference between what Quimby wrote and what somebody else wanted Quimby to represent. Dead authors do not get to correct the editor. Now, there is one detail in Quimby's surviving letters that I actually like. He wrote to a patient about returning $5 until the treatment he had prescribed to her had produced the results he expected. Now, does one letter prove he was always ethical, always effective, and never exaggerated? Of course not. But it does suggest he was not simply saying, "Thank you for the money, darling. If nothing changes, that means you failed to believe hard enough." He was at least presenting himself as accountable for whether he helped at all. And in a field where people routinely charge to remove a curse they invented 5 minutes earlier, I appreciate the basic impulse. Now let me answer the question underneath all of this. Do I believe the mind has power? Yes. Do I believe our thoughts affect our experience? Absolutely. Do I believe people can influence one another? We do it every day. You walk into a room angry and everybody feels it. You walk into a room grounded and people respond differently. You approach a problem believing you are helpless and you make different choices than you would if you believed you had options. Does that prove an invisible magnetic substance is flying out of your forehead? Well, that is the question, isn't it? And I'm not going to pretend that it does. But does it mean nothing is happening? Also no. And this is where I have to be honest about my own work. Tarot, astrology, ritual, mystical practice, those things have helped me. I've earned money. I have worked through psychological blocks. I have become more comfortable speaking publicly. I have used spiritual practice therapeutically. Have I manifested a fortune? Well, not yet. If I do, you will know, because the lighting in these videos is going to improve dramatically. But just because I am not rolling around in a vault full of enchanted money does not mean the work has done nothing. Sometimes the first result of a ritual is not a check. Sometimes it's courage. Sometimes it is clarity. And sometimes it is simply recognizing that a situation you kept calling destiny was actually just a person wasting your time. Those are changes. And often the inner change has to happen before the outer circumstances can begin to move. That is the part we miss when we treat spirituality like an online order. I lit the candle, where's my package? Well, maybe the first package was the fact that you finally stopped being afraid to ask for what you need. And maybe the second package was the confidence to make a different decision. Perhaps the third package arrives later because you finally did something with the first two to make room to receive the third. That does not mean every mystical claim is true. It means not every genuine result arrives looking like money. Darn. The same thing goes for a dream, an altered state, a near-death experience, or somebody's dramatic account of visiting another dimension. Or, we all hear about the ayahuasca, DMT adventures that some of these people go on, and they come back and they've met entities and all of that. Well, I still want to know what changed. But what changed does not have to be a winning lottery ticket. Did the person become less afraid? Did they repair a relationship? Did they repair a relationship with themselves? Did they stop living in a way that was destroying them? Did they come back with greater compassion, better boundaries, or the ability to face something they had been avoiding? All of that counts. What I am not interested in is endless spiritual tourism with no application whatsoever. If you have visited 12 dimensions and still cannot manage one honest conversation in this one, I have questions. And so when I look at Phineas Quimby, I am not going to demand that he prove he mastered the universe. He didn't. I am not going to demand that he live forever, because no one does. I am not going to pretend his financial records prove some grand law of manifestation. Maybe they do to him. What I am going to ask is whether he recognized something important, that what happens in the mind can affect what happens in the body, that fear can become part of suffering, that reassurance can change experience, that one person's presence can influence another person, and that understanding, attention, and belief may alter how somebody moves through the life they are already living. Was his explanation always correct? No, I'm sure it wasn't. Did some of the ideas become dangerous when people stretched them into blaming patients or rejecting medical treatment? Yes, absolutely. It's cruel to blame someone for their own illness as if they brought it on themselves. Even if you thought they did, it's cruel to do that to them. But did he help open a question that later writers could not leave alone? Yes. Yes, and that's the point. The idea kept living. And that is why Quimby belongs at the foundation of this series. Not because he proved magic, not because he became fabulously wealthy, and not because he escaped death, but because a clockmaker looked at human suffering and asked whether the mechanisms might involve more than anybody had bothered to notice. And whether you call that mind, suggestion, consciousness, resonance, psychology, spiritual force, or simply the power of being understood, the question is still alive. What changes when we change the way we think? What changes when somebody helps us see ourselves differently? And what becomes possible when the first transformation happens where nobody else can see it inside of us? That is the question Quimby leaves us. And frankly, for an Aquarius with a clock repair background, that is one hell of a legacy. Now next, I move from the foundational precursor to the first numbered author in the chronology, Warren Felt Evans. That's it. That's all I've got for you. Come back, and I'll see you in the next conversation about our dearly departed authors and the ideas that are still living. Bye now.